The air in my hometown, a small, picturesque town nestled in the fjords of British Columbia, always smelled of cedar and clean, cold water. That water was our lifeblood, our untouched heritage. I left to become an environmental engineer, dedicated to preserving that purity. When I returned, I found my ex-fiancé, Simon, and the town council preparing to sell it all, our pristine, irreplaceable water supply, to a ruthless international corporation. Simon, the man who once promised me forever, became the architect of our ruin and the orchestrator of my public disgrace. They thought they had silenced the only person who knew the truth. They sealed the contract with deceit and celebrated their victory with cheap champagne. But a king tide was coming, and I had studied the tide charts for months. My return to the coastal community was meant to be a fresh start. I had a small consulting business focused on sustainable municipal systems. Simon, however, had chosen a different path: political power and quick corporate cash. The town, desperate for municipal funding, was easily swayed by the mayor and Simon, who promised jobs and infrastructure improvements by selling exclusive, long-term rights to our main freshwater reservoir. The moment I saw the contract, I knew it was fraudulent. It undervalued the water by 90% and included no environmental protection clauses. I tried to sound the alarm, presenting my own rigorous engineering reports. But Simon moved faster. He used his influence to leak partial, misleading fragments of my personal life, painting me as a hysterical environmental extremist who was using the town's anxiety for my own business gain. He even forged signatures on a municipal approval document, validating his own flawed system design. The local paper, intimidated by the mayor, ran an editorial calling my warnings baseless fear-mongering. Within a week, my consulting contracts were terminated, my reputation was annihilated, and Simon, standing next to the mayor, gave a press conference where he coldly stated, "Elena has sadly confused personal feelings with professional facts. Her opinion is no longer relevant." I was effectively exiled, not physically but professionally and socially. Every door was shut, every former friend turned away. I watched Simon, charming, manipulative, and now disgustingly wealthy, break ground on the new corporate water intake facility. Legal attempts to stop the sale were useless. The town was compromised, and the corporation's high-powered lawyers had built a seemingly impenetrable fortress of paperwork. I went dark. I moved out of the town center, retreating to a small, isolated cabin near the old, abandoned part of the reservoir. I understood then that a conventional battle was lost. To beat them, I needed to find a weapon they hadn't considered, buried deep in the very land they were trying to exploit. I stopped looking at municipal codes and started studying history. I pored over ancient maps and environmental impact assessments from decades ago. That's when I found it: an obscure, centuries-old covenant established with a local indigenous band. This law, legally binding but rarely referenced, protected the pristine condition of a specific subterranean freshwater current. More critically, it mandated that any new infrastructure could not alter the natural filtration or flow of that current, which fed directly into our main supply. Simon, rushing construction and cutting corners to meet the corporate deadline, had utterly ignored this. His new intake system was technically sound for most conditions, but fatally flawed for the most extreme. He had placed the pipe too low and too far out, in a spot that, during a specific and rare astronomical phenomenon, a severe king tide, would be exposed to an immense backflow. That king tide would not just cover the intake, it would force a massive influx of salt water directly into the city's freshwater pipes. The contamination would be catastrophic, immediate, and would violate the ancient land covenant, instantly nullifying the entire contract with the corporation. My revenge was no longer about stopping the sale. It was about executing a perfect, devastating act of timed, irrefutable justice. I had a ticking clock. The king tide was due in exactly 3 weeks. I spent those weeks documenting everything, engaging an environmental law firm miles away who were untainted by Simon's influence. They confirmed the covenant's legality and the inevitable system failure. I knew exactly where and when to strike. The corporation had scheduled a lavish, public ceremony at the newly completed pumping station to celebrate the official signing and the transfer of the first massive payout check to Simon and the mayor. The date of the ceremony. The exact peak of the king tide. The day arrived. The corporate vice president, the mayor, and Simon stood on a stage draped in banners, a sparkling fountain centerpiece nearby. The moment the massive check, worth millions, was presented for the cameras, I walked through the security line. Simon spotted me and his smile vanished, replaced by cold fury. "Get her out of here, security," he hissed. I held up my hands, holding only a sealed envelope. "I'm not here to protest, Simon. I'm here to observe the consequences of fraud." "You're pathetic, Elena. You lost," he shouted, turning back to the smiling corporate VP, trying to salvage the moment. I glanced at my watch and then directly at the microphone. "Mr. Mayor Simon, I suggest you look at the celebratory fountain." As I spoke, the perfectly clear water jetting from the fountain turned a cloudy, brackish color. Then a distinct, harsh smell of brine hit the air. Simultaneously, the loud, piercing city emergency water siren began to wail across the entire cove. The celebration stopped dead. Confusion turned to horror as the corporate VP, an experienced man, tasted the water and spat it out, his face pale. "It's saline," he yelled into the microphone, his voice echoing panic. Simon, bewildered and frantic, stammered. "Impossible. The intake system is flawless. It's protected." I stepped forward, calm, in control. "It was protected against everything except the king tide, Simon, which you engineered to ignore in your haste. By placing the intake below the legally required elevation, you contaminated the entire freshwater supply with salt water, violating the ancient Indigenous land covenant. The contract," I announced, holding up my verified documents, "is null and void." The corporate VP, horrified by the environmental and legal disaster that now overshadowed the lucrative deal, seized the massive check from the mayor's hand and dramatically tore it in half. "This deal is off. You violated the environmental terms." Simon's fortune, his freedom, and his reputation collapsed in that instant. The RCMP, alerted by my law firm, arrived moments later, not for me, but for Simon and the mayor, holding warrants for conspiracy and massive environmental fraud. I watched Simon dragged away, the salt of the ocean now the salt of his ruin. The clean water was saved, but the arrogance of the greedy was permanently contaminated. The true value of wealth isn't in a corporate check. It's in the purity of the water we drink. Simon chose greed and betrayal, but I chose the silent, strategic justice of the land. His arrogance blinded him to the old laws, and my persistence timed his downfall perfectly. If you've ever been betrayed and had to fight for what's right on your own, this story is for you. The most devastating traps are always laid with precision. Drop a comment if you believe in the power of truth and environmental justice, and make sure to subscribe to Just an Unusual Story for more high-impact narratives.